right, this is part one of Learning Activity 9. Um, we're going to be looking at our simple responsibility principle trading, currency trading example. Um, we remember this is an example we started with earlier, and it was one big method. We then broke it up into multiple smaller methods. We then, in the last class, took those methods and broke them up into a number of different classes and put interfaces between them. And now we're going to start seeing how those interfaces will allow us to modify the code more easily. And then we'll continue this next week where we'll do a decorator pattern on those stuff. So start by cloning this project, the Unit 9 Trader project here in GitHub. So again, just get that assignment set up, clone it. We'll open up that solution then. And just a quick review of this. So we broke it up into classes and followed similar to what the textbook does, but now we're actually going to use the textbook solution from their GitHub repository. So it's a little different. So let me walk you through a couple things. Unit 9 Trader is the main file with the main code in it, but just to get back to that in a sec. First, all the interfaces have been moved into this Unit 9 Trader contracts area. So we have each of our interfaces is defined in here. So we'll have to remember that, and we'll have to use make sure we reference this trader.contracts when we're referring to an interface. Also, the trade record itself. Again, this is the record that we're using, our kind of data record that we're storing trades in. This is also in here. So these are kind of our utilities, our contract stuff. The database stuff has been moved into this ADO.NET separate project. I'm not quite sure why they moved it in a separate project, but the textbook does. So the ADO.NET stores this stuff in a database. I've converted it to use our Azure network connection up here. And so it uses our shared connection stuff. And remember, that shuts down after an hour of unuse. And so if you run this and it doesn't connect right away, count to 10 and run it again. And then the servers usually started up, spun up again at Amazon. Also, the SQL that we use to create the database structure is also in here, just as a placeholder. But again, most of the code is in this Unit 9 Trader. So it includes our main program. If you remember the structure of this, we create all of our objects and put our objects together and pass them to other objects here. So for example, we create our trade processor and we pass our trade processor. So we pass our trade processor, our trade data provider, our trade storage, and our trade parser here. So those are our three things we pass into our trade processor, and those are all defined up above. So we create an ADO.NET trade storage trade storage, and we pass that to the trade processor later on. Similar to our file data provider. Now, in this thing, we'll create two other data providers to read files, data from different things, and we'll substitute those in for our file trade provider. And what's nice is because these are running off this interface, that'll define the same interface, we can just swap them in and out here. So we'll swap in our URL trade provider here and set that up for that. Similarly, trade parser, if you remember, trade parser is defined here, and it uses a trade mapper and a trade validator. So we instantiate both of those and pass those to our trade parser, and then our trade parser is passed to our trade processor to do its work for this. We also have some other utilities. We have a console logger. So this wasn't clear in the book, or it was in the book, but I'm not sure if we did it in class. But we create a console logger which implements the iLogger interface here. So this does two different kinds of logs: log info or log warning. In both cases, it's concatenating the word warning or info to the message that's being logged for this. And so what we'll do is we'll create a console logger here, and we'll pass it to a number of the constructors so that the different objects we create will have a logger to use. We'll all use the same logger for this. So they won't just write the console, they'll use the console dot, the logger dot, whatever. We also have some other things. We have this trade file. Remember this trade.txt field? So this trade stream reads that file in. So that's our trade. We create a stream to that. That file is marked as a, if we look at the properties, it's marked as a embedded resource. So that means we can access it through this get manifest stuff. We also have the trade URL here. So this is a URL that we use to get our data from, and we have the RESTful URLs, and these are passed to our different objects. I mean, our new classes are for trade. Now, if we're on a trade processor, we pass in those objects into those. We trade storage to store to the database, trade provider to read it. And again, we say get trade data, parse, and store trade. So each of these objects basically does one functionality, and that follows our simple responsibility principle fairly well for this. So if we look back, we're going to now modify this and add a stream, a URL trade data provider for this here. So as a trader, I want to be able to read trades from a company's new web service provider. So this is just going to read from a file, use it over a URL, and then in part 2 we'll read from a REST API for it and look at that, how that might be different. So we're going to use some test-driven design. So we have these unit tests. We have a URL trade data provider test that's not going to pass yet, and so you have to modify the code until you get it to pass for this. So if we look at our code and we run all of our tests and we bring up we view our test explorer, here we can look at these tests. I'm going to move this window around a little bit, try to get this to show up a little on this screen. Okay, so our unit tests, you see there's some X's there, and we can swap what we're seeing. So we can see some of these are passing. So our trade mapper tests are all passing. That's good. So we have 4 tests in there. They're all good. And on trade validator, 3 of them don't pass, and we won't fix that till the assignment. So you'll do test-driven design on the assignment portion this week, and you'll fix those. We're going to limit large and small trades and not let those pass. But we're going to look at this URL trade data provider. That test fails, and in part 2 we'll do the RESTful trade provider. So again, this just has 1 test in it, and it's not passing, just tests if it can read from a URL or read from a RESTful service. We do have another stream data provider, and that just has 1. It just reads, makes sure we can read from a file and properly, and that just does that. Okay, so back here, so we want to make sure that URL trade data provider tests pass, and it doesn't. So we want to modify the URL trade data provider, and what's done, this is what I often think of with test-driven design, is someone's gone in, like a senior designer or senior developer has gone in and done the basic setup for you. So that senior developer set up a URL trade provider class that implements this interface in the same way that our stream data provider implements that interface. So we implement that interface and then just implement that interface, and so all that does is define the get trade data method, and it just throws an exception. Says it's not implemented yet. And then we also need a constructor here, and we're passing in a URL that we're going to use in this to get the data from, and a logger that we can log messages from. Now right now these aren't stored anywhere, they're just passed in here, so we're going to have to store them and work with them. But again, the basic structure is set up, and then the main program, the test environment set up, and in fact even here the main program is also set up. So we define a URL trade provider, and here's our URL, and we can actually try out this URL here. So if I open up my web browser and just go to that URL, it's just a file, text file stored on a local server. So it's just on the faculty.css .edu server, and it just has some some sample trades. So this isn't using an API, where it's just grabbing a file over the internet rather than a local file for that. And so that's set up here, and then we have this, but where we define it, but you see it's grayed out because we're not actually using it yet, so we'll have to use that. So your job is then to modify this code here, and I give you some starting code again because we haven't done this. So I would say grab this starting code here, copy it out, and where we throw this exception, we'll delete that and put this new code in there and try to get this to work. Now, one thing, this should be a list of strings. I had a typo in there. So it should be a list of strings for that. And then why don't you pause this and see if you can get this data to work. Store these, the string, the URL, and the logger in variables. They're passed in another constructor. You'll need those here for stuff. Add a log statement maybe to show something going on here, and try to get this work, do whatever includes you want. Okay, so pause this and see if you can get this to work. And I'm just going to walk through this. So hopefully you've paused this and tried it out. So again, we want this string URL and the IR logger. We need those local variables. So I'm just going to add those down below here as two local variables. And then when we're passed in here, we're just going to store them. So this dot URL is equal to URL, and this dot logger is equal to logger. So the constructor passes those in, and we just store them in these local variables. These are our method variables. Okay, so now that clears up this when we're opening this URL that's there. And I could use the logger. Now I'm going to actually look at the other one and see what we're calling logger.log information. We're saying reading trades. So right at the top, all we're doing is just saying we're reading from the file. And I want to do that here too, so we make sure we're reading from the right file. So here, before we even do much, I'm going to add a log statement. So again, I'm just going to say logger dot log info, not log warning, and I'm just going to say some text. So reading trade file from URL, and maybe I'll actually specify that URL here, so I can just do URL and put a semicolon at the end. Okay, so now I'm just going to log that we're reading that here. Web client, we've got to include system.net, using that. Stream reader, again, using system.io, so we got to make sure those are up here. We don't really need system.text. I'm going to delete that, I think. And I already have contracts here because we needed those for these interfaces. Okay, so now let's go through this. We declare a list. So all we're doing is reading a file in one line at a time, storing each line into a separate string and putting it all together in a list of strings. So we declare a new list of strings called string data. We start up a web client. We're given a URL here when we do the constructor. And so we just open that URL here as a stream. And then the rest of this is just like the other one. Basically, we create a stream reader using that stream. We're just reading then each line. While each line does not equal null, we just read the next line in, and it'll eventually be null when we get to the end of file. We read each line in from the file, from the URL, and each line gets added to this list. It starts as an empty list, and we add each things. We're returning a list, actually IEnumerable, which is again an uneditable version of a list, interface into a list or any collection there. So we're returning trade data as that. So that's all we need to do here. We can save that, push that if we want. Now we can do a couple things. We can run our tests here. So if I bring back our test environment and run our tests, hopefully this URL trade provider tests will be good. So yep, we're now passing that test. We haven't done the RESTful one, and the simple validation, we're doing the assignment, but we've got one more green check here, so that's good for this. And then we can actually run the program itself. And it reads the data from the file system. So this isn't right. We want to be reading that from the URL, not from the file system. So we forgot something there. So let's go back and look. Now, if we go back to our main program here, we create this URL trade provider and we pass in the URL for that. But you notice it's gray. That's because we never use it. When we create our trade processor, we need to pass in this URL trade provider, and so now we'll be using that. So yeah, we want to update that, and this is all we have to do. What's nice about this structure is that since these all implement the same interface, we can swap from one to the other. So rather than doing from a file, we can switch this to our URL trade provider, send that in. This trade processor just expects a trade data and just knows that it's going to call process trades. No, yeah, get trade data. It knows that that's because that's what's defined in the interface there. The trade data provider interface is just get trade data. So it knows whatever it's going to have a get trade data method. So it's just going to call that here. So we can swap this out. So now we swap that out. We can then save that and run this again. Let's bring this over. And now it says reading trade file from a URL, and now it's reading it from a URL and processing the trades. And again, if this is writing to Amazon, so it went pretty fast, so you know that web service is up and running for the next hour till whilst people are using it. If it's not, just again pause and run it again. So, okay, so that ends part 1 here, where we've used test-driven design. Our test now passes, and we're good. So.